September 1943. A dimly lit cafe in Lyon, France. Nancy Wake sat across from a German officer, her lips curved in a practiced smile as she laughed at his jokes. Her dress was elegant, her makeup perfect, her French flawless. To the officer, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a wealthy, beautiful woman enjoying an evening out despite the war. He couldn't have known that the charming woman sipping wine with him was British intelligence's most wanted operative in France. That her handbag contained forged documents. That she'd killed a German sentry with her bare hands just 3 days earlier. The officer leaned closer, clearly interested in more than conversation. Nancy encouraged him with a touch on his arm, a well-timed glance. While he focused on her face, she memorized the insignia on his uniform, the documents visible in his briefcase, the details of troop movements he carelessly mentioned. By the end of the evening, she'd extracted critical intelligence without him realizing he'd given away anything at all. It was a performance she'd perfected over years of dangerous work. A performance that made her the Gestapo's most wanted person in France, with a 5 million franc bounty on her head. This is the story of Nancy Wake, the woman the Gestapo called the White Mouse, because she was so difficult to capture. A woman who used her beauty and charm as weapons as deadly as any gun or knife, who transformed traditional espionage by weaponizing femininity itself, and who proved that in the shadows of occupied Europe, a woman's smile could be more dangerous than an entire Wehrmacht battalion. To understand how Nancy Wake became one of the war's most effective operatives, you have to understand how completely unprepared intelligence services were for women like her. In 1939, when war broke out, British intelligence largely viewed women as secretaries and support staff. The idea of women in combat roles was dismissed as absurd. Women lacked the physical strength, the emotional control, the ruthlessness required for field operations, or so the theory went. Nancy Wake proved every assumption wrong. Born in New Zealand in 1912, she'd moved to Australia as a child before running away to London as a young woman. She worked as a journalist in Paris in the 1930s, where she witnessed Nazi persecution firsthand during a trip to Vienna. The experience radicalized her. When war came, she was living in Marseille with her wealthy French husband, Henri Fiacca, enjoying a comfortable life that war would shatter completely. The fall of France in June 1940 transformed everything. German occupation turned daily life into a nightmare of checkpoints, curfews, and arbitrary violence. For Nancy, the occupation was personal. She'd seen what the Nazis did. She understood that comfortable neutrality meant collaboration, so she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She would fight. Nancy began by helping Allied soldiers and downed airmen escape through southern France into Spain. The work seemed simple initially, providing safe houses, false documents, food, and guides. But the Germans were hunting escaped prisoners ruthlessly. The Gestapo had networks of informers. One careless word could mean arrest, torture, and execution. The escape network Nancy joined was part of a larger resistance organization moving hundreds of Allied servicemen out of occupied France. The routes were dangerous, crossing mountains in winter, navigating past German patrols, relying on guides who might be double agents. Nancy made the journey multiple times, leading groups of escapees who couldn't speak French through checkpoints where discovery meant death. Her technique at checkpoints became legendary. While male resistance members tried to appear invisible and unremarkable, Nancy did the opposite. She dressed stylishly, wore makeup, carried herself with confidence. She flirted outrageously with German guards, distracting them with smiles and conversation, while the soldiers she was smuggling slipped through with forged papers. German soldiers saw an attractive woman being friendly and didn't look closer. It was a brilliant exploitation of their assumptions. The Gestapo began noticing someone was operating very effectively in the region. Escape lines that should have been compromised remained intact. Soldiers kept disappearing from German custody. There were reports of a woman, but descriptions varied wildly. She seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, slipping through surveillance like smoke. They gave her a code name, the White Mouse. By 1943, Nancy had helped hundreds of Allied servicemen escape, but the Gestapo was closing in. They'd begun systematic surveillance of suspected resistance members. Nancy's husband Henry became a target because of his wealth and connections. The Gestapo arrested and interrogated him repeatedly, trying to break him, to make him reveal his wife's activities. He never talked. His silence would cost him everything. In late 1943, Nancy received warning that the Gestapo had identified her. Agents were coming to arrest her. She had hours at most. She couldn't warn Henry. Any contact would expose him further. She simply disappeared, leaving behind her comfortable life, her husband, everything. She made it to Spain through the Pyrenees, then to England. She thought she'd return to France within weeks. She never saw Henry again. In London, Nancy volunteered for the Special Operations Executive, Churchill's organization dedicated to setting Europe ablaze through sabotage and subversion. SOE was desperate for agents who could operate in France, particularly women who could move through checkpoints more easily than men. But SOE's training program was brutal. Most volunteers washed out. Nancy excelled. The physical training pushed candidates to their limits, forced marches with heavy packs, obstacle courses, hand-to-hand combat. Nancy matched or exceeded male trainees' performance. She learned silent killing techniques, how to handle explosives, how to operate radios, how to live under cover. Instructors noted her fearlessness, her quick thinking, and her complete lack of hesitation when violence was required. Weapons training revealed natural talent. She became proficient with pistols, submachine guns, and grenades. But her most effective weapon remained something no instructor could teach: the ability to manipulate people through charm and misdirection. While other agents learned to hide, Nancy learned to hide in plain sight by being exactly what people expected to see. Parachute training was her one moment of hesitation. Jumping from aircraft into darkness over enemy territory terrified her. But she did it anyway, recognizing that fear was just another obstacle to overcome. In April 1944, Nancy Wake parachuted into the Auvergne region of central France as part of a three-person team. Their mission was to organize and arm resistance groups for coordinated action during the coming Allied invasion. The Auvergne was wild country, mountainous and heavily forested. Maquis resistance groups, named after the scrub vegetation they hid in, operated in the hills, but they were poorly armed and loosely organized. Nancy's job was to change that. She was officially the team's courier, theoretically the least important role. In practice, she would become the operation's linchpin. The drop itself was chaotic. Nancy landed in a tree, suspended 15 feet off the ground in her parachute harness. She hung there in darkness, listening for German patrols, before resistance members found her and cut her down. Welcome to occupied France. No ceremony, no preparation time, just immediate danger and urgent work. The local Maquis groups were skeptical of this British parachutist, especially when they realized she was a woman. French resistance fighters, brave as they were, shared their era's assumptions about women's capabilities. Nancy would have to prove herself. She did so immediately and dramatically. The team's first challenge was finding a secure base of operations. Nancy identified a remote farmhouse, but it required evicting a German garrison occupying nearby buildings. Rather than avoid the Germans, Nancy walked directly to their position, introduced herself as a lost traveler, and spent an hour charming the garrison commander while memorizing their dispositions, routines, and weapon placements. That night, the Maquis attacked with perfect intelligence, overwhelming the garrison before they could respond. Word spread quickly. The British woman wasn't just competent, she was aggressive, clever, and completely fearless. Nancy used her gender as both disguise and weapon. She could approach German positions that male resistance fighters couldn't get near. A woman asking directions, looking for a lost dog, or claiming car trouble drew helpful responses rather than suspicion. By the time Germans realized their mistake, it was too late. SOE supplied weapons and explosives through nighttime parachute drops. Nancy organized reception committees, coordinating with London on radio schedules, finding secure drop zones, and distributing the supplies. The work was extremely dangerous. German direction-finding equipment could locate radio transmissions. Patrols swept the countryside hunting resistance groups. Informers were everywhere. Nancy's approach to security was pragmatic and brutal. When a Maquis member was suspected of being a German informer, she didn't debate or investigate extensively. She verified what she could, made a decision, and executed it personally. Cold-blooded murder of potential traitors wasn't pleasant work, but it was necessary. One informer could destroy entire networks and get hundreds killed. The weapons drops transformed the Maquis from poorly armed partisans into effective guerrilla fighters. British Sten guns, explosives, ammunition, and supplies arrived regularly. Nancy organized the groups into coordinated units, established communication networks, and planned operations. She wasn't just a courier anymore. She was effectively commanding thousands of resistance fighters. Her methods were unorthodox. Traditional military operations emphasized careful planning and avoiding unnecessary risk. Nancy's approach was aggressive improvisation. She believed audacity itself was a weapon. Germans expected resistance fighters to hide in the hills. Nancy led raids into German-occupied towns in daylight. Germans expected guerrillas to avoid checkpoints. Nancy drove through them with forged papers and devastating confidence. One operation illustrated her methods perfectly. The team needed to destroy a German ammunition depot, heavily guarded and considered impregnable. Nancy dressed in an elegant outfit, acquired a bicycle, and rode directly to the depot's entrance. She told guards she was lost and needed directions. While guards focused on the attractive woman with the bicycle, she memorized every detail: guard positions, shift changes, fence weak points, patrol patterns. That night, the Maquis attacked with surgical precision, hitting exactly where defenses were weakest at exactly the right moment. The depot exploded in a fireball visible for miles. German response forces found nothing but bicycle tracks leading away. The white mouse had struck again. As D-Day approached, Nancy's operations intensified. SOE wanted maximum disruption of German communications and transportation in central France. German reinforcements heading to Normandy had to be delayed or prevented from reaching the invasion beaches. Nancy organized sabotage teams targeting railways, bridges, telephone lines, and roads. The Auvergne became a nightmare for German logistics. The operations weren't bloodless. Nancy personally participated in ambushes of German convoys, firing a Sten gun from cover alongside Maquis fighters. She helped plant explosives on railway tracks, destroying trains carrying supplies and reinforcements. She coordinated attacks on German administrative buildings, killing officers and destroying records. The violence was necessary, ugly work, but she never hesitated. German reprisals were savage. When resistance fighters killed Germans, the occupiers executed civilians in retaliation. Entire villages were burned. Hostages were shot. The Gestapo tortured captured resistance members to death, trying to break the networks. Nancy witnessed the consequences of her operations, innocent people dying because of actions she'd ordered. The moral weight was crushing, but she never stopped. She learned later what happened to Henry. The Gestapo had tortured him repeatedly, trying to make him reveal his wife's location or activities. He never talked. They executed him in October 1943. Nancy was in England at the time, preparing for deployment. She wouldn't learn of his death until after the war. The man she'd loved had been murdered because of her resistance work. The guilt would haunt her for decades. But in summer 1944, she couldn't think about personal costs. The work consumed everything. She was coordinating thousands of resistance fighters, organizing dozens of sabotage operations, moving constantly to avoid German search teams that were hunting her specifically. The Gestapo knew the white mouse was in the Auvergne. The bounty on her head had reached 5 million francs, more than any other Allied agent in France. One of her closest calls came in July. German forces launched a massive operation against Maquis positions, deploying over 10,000 troops to crush resistance in the region. Nancy found herself commanding approximately 7,000 resistance fighters in desperate running battles through the mountains. For days, the combat was continuous: ambushes, retreats, brief stands, narrow escapes. During one engagement, Nancy's radio operator was killed, without radio contact with London. They couldn't request supplies or coordinate with other groups. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Nancy made a decision that shocked everyone. She would bicycle to another resistance group over 200 kilometers away through German-controlled territory to use their radio. Alone, at night, the journey would take her directly through areas where German troops were actively hunting resistance fighters. She left at dusk with a bicycle, forged papers, a pistol hidden in her clothing, and nothing else. For 3 days she cycled through checkpoints, past German patrols, across mountain roads. When stopped, she played various roles: lost traveler, messenger, foolish woman who'd taken a wrong turn. Her French was perfect, her papers were flawless, and her performance was convincing. She made it to the distant resistance group, transmitted her messages, and cycled back. Over 400 kilometers on a bicycle through German lines, alone. The Maquis fighters were stunned. Male resistance leaders who'd questioned whether a woman could handle field operations now followed her orders without hesitation. She'd proven herself beyond any doubt. The operations she commanded intensified through July and August as Allied forces broke out from Normandy. German forces in central France began retreating, and Nancy's fighters harassed them mercilessly. The Maquis, under her coordination, destroyed bridges, ambushed retreating columns, and cut communications. German units trying to withdraw through the Auvergne found themselves under constant attack. Some surrendered rather than fight through. Others were destroyed piecemeal. The 200,000 German troops in southern France that might have reinforced Normandy were pinned down or delayed by resistance fighters Nancy had helped arm and organize. By September 1944, Allied forces advancing from the south linked up with resistance groups. The Auvergne was liberated. Nancy had survived. Of the approximately 400 SOE agents sent into France, over 100 died or were captured and executed. Nancy's survival was partly luck, partly skill, and partly the fact that she'd never followed conventional tradecraft. She didn't hide, she stood out. She didn't avoid Germans, she engaged with them. Her methods were so unconventional that they worked. After liberation, Nancy received a hero's welcome. The French awarded her the Croix de Guerre with 2 palms, the Médaille de la Résistance, and later made her a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur. The British gave her the George Medal and made her a Companion of the Order of Australia. The Americans awarded her the Medal of Freedom. She was one of the most decorated women of the war. But personal cost shadowed these honors. Henry was dead, tortured and murdered by the Gestapo. The comfortable life she'd known in Marseille was gone forever. The hundreds of people who died in operations she'd commanded or in German reprisals haunted her. She'd done terrible things in service of a just cause, and the memories didn't fade with victory. Post-war life proved difficult for Nancy. The skills that made her an exceptional operative, ruthlessness, fearlessness, comfort with violence, didn't translate well to peacetime. She tried various jobs but found civilian life boring after years of constant danger. She married again briefly, but the relationship failed. She struggled with alcoholism and depression, common among SOE veterans who'd experienced and done things that couldn't be discussed. For decades, Nancy's story remained relatively unknown outside intelligence circles. SOE records were classified. The full extent of women's contributions to wartime intelligence work wasn't publicly acknowledged. Nancy herself was reluctant to discuss details, bound by official secrets and personal trauma. Only as records were gradually declassified did the full story emerge. What emerged was extraordinary. Nancy Wake had commanded thousands of resistance fighters, organized hundreds of sabotage operations, killed German soldiers in combat, and become the Gestapo's most wanted person in France. She'd cycled over 400 kilometers through enemy territory on a critical mission. She'd parachuted into occupied France, lived under constant danger of capture and torture, and survived when so many others didn't. Her methods revolutionized thinking about women in intelligence work. Traditional espionage theory held that women should be invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. Nancy proved the opposite could be effective. Being memorable, being noticed, but controlling what people noticed. That was her genius. German soldiers remembered an attractive woman flirting with them. They didn't remember the forged papers she was carrying or the intelligence she was gathering. She weaponized every stereotype about women. Germans assumed women weren't dangerous. Nancy used that assumption to get close to targets, gather intelligence, and execute operations. Germans assumed beautiful women were vain and frivolous. Nancy played that role while commanding guerrilla armies. Germans assumed women couldn't handle violence. Nancy killed without hesitation when necessary. Modern intelligence services study her methods. The concept of using sexuality and charm as intelligence tools, honey traps in modern terminology, has roots in operations like Nancy's. But her approach was more sophisticated than simple seduction. She understood psychology, manipulation, and how to control situations through personality alone. For historians studying women's contributions to World War II, Nancy Wake represents a broader transformation. The war forced societies to acknowledge women's capabilities in areas previously considered exclusively male domains. Women proved they could handle combat, command authority, execute violent operations, and maintain operational security under extreme pressure. The myth of female unsuitability for dangerous work was shattered by women like Nancy, who simply did the job and succeeded. Nancy lived to 98, dying in 2011 in London. In later years, she was finally comfortable discussing her wartime experiences. She gave interviews, wrote autobiography, and became a symbol of wartime courage. But she was also refreshingly honest about the moral complexities. She'd killed people. She'd ordered operations that resulted in civilian deaths. She'd done terrible things for good reasons. She didn't apologize, but neither did she glorify it. In her final years, she was asked if she'd do it again, knowing what it would cost. She said yes without hesitation. The Nazis had to be stopped. The cost was worth it. Henry would have understood. The resistance fighters who died would have understood. It was the answer of someone who'd lived through moral choices most people never face and made decisions she could live with. The story of Nancy Wake proves that war doesn't respect conventional boundaries of gender or expectation. It demands results. Nancy delivered those results using every tool available, including tools that male operatives couldn't access. Her beauty, her charm, her ability to manipulate assumptions about femininity, these became weapons as effective as guns or explosives. The White Mouse earned her nickname not through hiding, but through constantly moving, constantly adapting, constantly exploiting enemy assumptions. She was one step ahead because she understood that the greatest disguise wasn't invisibility. It was being exactly what people expected while doing the opposite of what they anticipated. In the end, Nancy Wake transformed espionage by proving that a woman's smile could indeed be a deadly weapon when wielded by someone who understood exactly how to use it. The pin-up spy who flirted her way past German checkpoints was also the ruthless operative who killed sentries silently and commanded thousands in battle. The contradiction was itself the weapon, and it helped win the war.